They said her name with a whisper. Ruth, the widow of the cotton fields, a woman who moved like a shadow in 1839, when the soil of the American South was soaked not only with sweat but with blood. 13 men, farmers, overseers, even a preacher, met, their deaths in ways so brutal, so ritualistic, that the townsfolk swore it wasn't human hands at work. They found their throats cut with precision, bodies laid out in strange formations, symbols carved into their chests that no one dared to interpret. But the most chilling part, Ruth herself, the lonely widow, rumored to be half-mad, half-possessed, was seen at the edge of the fields on every night death visited. And then one evening she simply vanished. No body, no grave, no witness. Just silence, and a wound in history that was quickly buried. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't the kind of ghost story told by firelight. It is something deeper, something that will make you question the institutions that built America, the churches that preached purity, and the men who wrote the history you were forced to memorize. You've been handed the version of events that paints Ruth as a deranged witch, a madwoman who slipped into the swamps to die. But those who know the hidden archives, those who have seen the forbidden letters and the sealed trials, whisper of another truth. Ruth wasn't insane. She was awakened. She understood something about the cotton fields that others refused to see. They were not merely fields. They were altars. The men who died weren't chosen at random. Each one was a part of a system, an order, men sworn to uphold a structure that enslaved not just bodies, but minds. Ruth struck at the hierarchy, cutting it where it was most vulnerable, and the symbols carved into her victims weren't lunacy. They were warnings, markings of a forgotten cult that predated the plantations, older than the soil itself, and when Ruth disappeared, it wasn't an escape. It was an initiation. They say she walked into the cotton and was swallowed whole by the earth, offered to something that demanded sacrifice. But here's the question no one has ever dared to ask. Who taught her? Who unlocked her hand, guided her blade, and then erased her from the record? This isn't just a story of murder. This is the fracture line where forbidden knowledge seeps through, knowledge the elite wanted buried. The court records of 1839 are like a corpse with its organs ripped out, hollow, missing, deliberately mutilated. The trial of Ruth should have been a sensation, a spectacle too delicious for the newspapers to ignore. 13 murders, a widow accused of ritual slayings. In that era, it would have been the greatest public theater of the South. And yet, no such records survive. What remains are fragments, one torn ledger in a courthouse attic, a single page of testimony smudged with ink, and a sermon preached 2 Sundays after her disappearance, warning the congregation that the devil had walked among them. But dig beneath that surface, and another story emerges. The ledger doesn't call Ruth a murderer. It calls her an instrument. Over and over again, the word repeats. The widow, Ruth, is not alone. She is an instrument. But for whom? The Bay? Church? The state? Or something older than both? When you trace the men who died, you start to see a pattern. They were not random overseers or simple farmers. Each was tied by oath or by blood to a hidden society of planters who gathered, not for worship but for control. They called themselves the Cotton Brotherhood. Behind their wealth, behind their polite smiles and Sunday suits, they were engaged in a ritual economy. The cotton was not just their profit, it was their offering. Human suffering was their tithe, and Ruth? She wasn't their victim, she was their defector. Somewhere in the shadows of grief after her husband's death, she stumbled across the truth. The Brotherhood had marked her land, taken her husband into their fold, and bled him dry. His death wasn't natural, it was ceremonial. The widow discovered their symbols, their rites, and the whispered doctrine that Cotton was consecrated by blood. Her vengeance was not madness, it was revelation. That's why her killings mirrored their rituals. It was not chaos, it was inversion. She carved their own symbols into their flesh, turning their power back on them. That is why the Brotherhood erased the records. To admit Ruth's truth was to expose their hidden empire. Better to let the world believe in a mad woman than in a widow who had seen behind the veil. And so, Ruth vanished, not as a fugitive, but as a sacrifice erased by the same hands she struck against. The Brotherhood didn't fear her blade. They feared her knowledge. You're starting to see it, aren't you? How the story of Ruth isn't really about a woman or even about murder. It's about control. History is edited not to protect the innocent, but to protect the guilty. 13 deaths, and yet the Brotherhood lived on. The plantation system expanded, Cotton became king, and the widow's name was reduced to a whisper of madness. Do you see how it works? They erase not the crime, but the truth of the crime. They don't bury bodies, they bury meanings. Now let me ask you something that should shake you. Why 13? Numbers are not accidents in ritual systems. 13 is the number of rupture, of breaking the cycle, of rebellion against order. In secret societies, it marks the outsider who dares to challenge the circle of 12. Ruth wasn't killing men, she was killing a system. One blade stroke at a time, she was cutting through the web of oaths, binding the Brotherhood together. And that's why she had to vanish, not because she was defeated, but because she had become too powerful, too symbolic. Think about it. If a widow in 1839, with no wealth, no status, no voice, could pierce the heart of an institution with nothing but courage and rage, what does that say about you? What power have you been trained to forget? What instincts have been smothered beneath sermons, rules, and distractions? This is where the darkness begins to coil tighter. Because Ruth is not just a ghost of history. She is a mirror. A mirror the institutions don't want you to look into. They want you to believe you are powerless, a cog, a servant. They want you to bow before their symbols, their rituals, their false order. Ruth broke it. That's why her story was erased. That's why you were never meant to hear it. And here's the part that will gnaw at your mind long after this video ends. Some say Ruth did not disappear at all. They say she was taken underground, not by force but by initiation, into an older current, into a network that still exists, hidden beneath the veneer of American respectability. A current that whispers, the Brotherhood was never destroyed. It simply put on new masks. The men who died in 1839, they were just pawns. The real players, the architects, remain. And Ruth may not have been their enemy at all. She may have been their creation. Ask yourself, if Ruth's killings were truly the work of a mad woman, why erase the records? Why not display her trial as a warning to the masses? Why not hang her corpse in the town square as proof of justice? That's how the system usually works. Punishment in public, so fear can spread like wildfire. But Ruth's end was silence. Sealed files, missing testimony. The Brotherhood didn't want her feared. They wanted her forgotten, and this is how power truly operates, not through spectacle but through erasure. You think you know history because you memorized the polished surface they fed you in school. But history is a machine of selection. It chooses what you may know, what you may question, and what must never be spoken. What happened in those cotton fields wasn't just a sequence of murders, it was a rupture in the order. Ruth became proof that the system could be broken. And so the system erased her. But look closer, and you will see the same pattern repeated across centuries. Institutions present themselves as guardians of morality, churches, courts, schools, governments. Yet behind every sermon and every law is the same logic as the Brotherhood. Control through ritual, obedience through fear, silence through memory manipulation. Ruth's story was simply an early example of how the game is played. Here is a truth they will never admit. Slavery was not just an economic system. It was a spiritual economy. Fields became altars. Human suffering became an offering. The overseers, the preachers, the landowners, they weren't just exploiting bodies. They were sustaining a structure. And when Ruth struck, she didn't just kill men, she threatened to collapse their altar. That's why the Brotherhood closed ranks. That's why the church preached of the devil instead of revealing the human corruption in their own pulpits. Now let me turn to you directly. How many of your own memories have been erased? Not in history books, but in your daily life. How many truths have you been conditioned to ignore because they would shatter the comfort of obedience? They do not need to burn witches anymore. They only need you distracted, busy, docile. You think the cotton fields are gone, but look around. Modern fields exist, only the crop has changed. Now it is your attention, your labor, your mind that they harvest. And just like Ruth, you stand at the edge of a choice, to see or to remain blind. You've been told your whole life that the past is gone, that history is nothing more than a dusty book on a shelf. But men who understand power know this. History isn't in the past. It is the blueprint. The Brotherhood of the cotton fields didn't die in 1839. They adapted. They changed costumes, changed languages, but the structure remained. Ruth's 13 murders didn't end their reign. It exposed it. And exposure is the one thing the powerful cannot allow. Now let me ask you something dangerous. What if Ruth wasn't erased but absorbed? What if her so-called rebellion was not the end, but the beginning of another design? In secret orders, defection and initiation are sometimes the same act. You kill the pawns, and the architects take notice. You spill blood, and the door opens. Ruth may not have vanished into silence. She may have ascended into a darker current. A current that outlived the fields, outlived the South, and continues in boardrooms, churches, and governments today. You feel it, don't you? The sense that your life has been steered, shaped, confined. That invisible hands pull at your choices, your fears, your future. That isn't paranoia. It's programming. They don't need chains on your wrists anymore. They've learned to chain your perception, to curate what you think is possible. That is the modern plantation, and every man alive is standing in it. This is why Ruth matters. Because she represents the fracture line, the moment when someone sees behind the veil. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you hear the hidden rhythm, the rituals in the shadows, the false symbols paraded in daylight, you cannot return to silence. And that is why I'm speaking to you now, because you too are standing at that edge. But beware, awakening is not comfort. Ruth's story is proof of that. She did not find peace, she did not find safety, she found power, and power is never free. To awaken is to inherit the burden of sight, to inherit the scars of knowing, and yet that is the only path to mastery. So I ask you, will you remain among the sleeping, waiting to be harvested, or will you follow Ruth into the forbidden, where truth is sharp, dangerous, and permanent? The deeper you dig into Ruth's story, the less it feels like murder, and the more it feels like initiation. The bodies she left behind were marked, with symbols carved so carefully, so deliberately, that they could not have been random. One recurring mark was described in a surviving letter. A circle broken once, with a downward point. That symbol doesn't belong to Christianity, or to any farmer's superstition. It belongs to something older, a current that seeped through Europe into the New World, a current that cloaked itself beneath churches and courts while its true rituals pulsed beneath the surface. And here is where the sickness becomes clear. The Brotherhood wasn't a small-town secret. They were a cell in a network. The cotton wasn't just cash, it was consecration. The labor, the suffering, the blood. It fed something they believed themselves chosen to serve. Ruth didn't just kill men. She desecrated their altar, but desecration and initiation are two sides of the same coin. When she carved those symbols into their flesh, she wasn't only exposing their hidden order, she was inscribing herself into it. Do you see how this works? You don't escape the system by fighting it with anger alone. If you fight the ritual, you enter the ritual. Ruth's vanishing wasn't a retreat into the swamp, it was a transformation. She stepped into the current that the Brotherhood themselves served, but on different terms. That's why her name was erased from public record. Because to admit she had crossed into that knowledge would be to admit that the institutions are not the highest power, that there is something older, hungrier, and invisible guiding them still, and that invisible hand has never gone away. The A symbols Ruth carved are still with us, hidden in plain sight, etched into architecture, woven into corporate logos, embedded in the seals of government. You've seen them 1,000 times, but you were trained to look away, conditioned to see design instead of doctrine. They write their ownership on the world, and you obey without knowing. Ruth's 13 victims. That was the visible war. The invisible war is still happening every day around you. Institutions are not neutral. They are channels, vessels carrying this current forward. The schools that taught you obedience, the pulpits that demanded submission, the banks that drain your labor, they are all Brotherhood by another name. And here is the cruelest truth. When Ruth vanished, the Brotherhood didn't lose. They adapted, and they are still here. You've heard Ruth's story as though it was something buried in the cotton fields of 1839. But the truth is, it's not buried at all. It's alive in you, because the same structure that ruled her world rules yours. Different faces, different uniforms, different symbols, but the same skeleton beneath it all. And just like Ruth, you've been told to stay silent, to obey, to accept the world as it is. Look at your life. From childhood, you were placed in institutions that mirrored the Brotherhood. The schoolhouse taught you repetition, not thought. The church taught you submission, not spirit. The government taught you dependency, not power. You were raised in a system where obedience is holy and questioning is dangerous. That's not an accident, it's design. The cotton fields may be gone, but the plantation never ended. It simply changed crops, and now you are the harvest. Ruth didn't vanish because she was insane. She vanished because she saw. She understood that the rituals of the Brotherhood weren't superstition, they were psychology. Control isn't just about chains and whips. It's about shaping the mind so deeply that a man polices himself. And isn't that what you do? Don't you silence your own doubts before you even speak them aloud? Don't you obey invisible rules you never agreed to just to keep your place in line? That is the ritual. That is the altar. Here is the part you were never supposed to realize. Ruth's killings were not rebellion alone. They were initiation. She marked her enemies with their own symbols because she was turning their system against itself. That's the power the Brotherhood feared most, not rage, but awareness. Once a man sees the pattern, the control weakens. Once a man recognizes the ritual, he steps outside of it. And so I ask you, what happens when you begin to see the patterns in your own life? The repeated symbols, the repeated chains, the repeated lies. What happens when you realize you're not living freely at all, but playing a role written for you long before you were born? This is where Ruth's story becomes your test. Will you ignore the whisper and keep walking blind? Or will you acknowledge the mirror she left behind and begin the same transformation she began? By now you've felt it. That tightening in your chest, that unease in your mind. Because deep down you know Ruth's story isn't about her. It's about you. The Brotherhood may have carved their symbols into flesh, but the modern order has carved them into your life. Every paycheck you bleed for, every rule you follow without question, every false promise you cling to, it's all the same ritual. And if you can see it, you are already standing where Ruth once stood, at the edge of awakening. But here's the cost. Once you step into this knowledge, you can't step back. That's why her story was buried. That's why your history books lied. Because knowledge is transformation, and transformation is dangerous to the order. You cannot hear what you've just heard and remain the same man you were yesterday. You've been marked, and that mark demands a response. So I'm asking you to take the first step, not just to watch, not just to listen, to act right here, right now. Because initiation is never passive, it requires a declaration. And here is yours. Type these words into the comments twice as your mark of entry. I see the altar. Write it once for Ruth and once for yourself. That phrase will brand you as someone who has crossed over, someone who refuses to remain blind. Do it, and you lock in your identity, not just to this channel, not just to this community, but to yourself. Do you understand how powerful that act is? To declare publicly, even in a small way, that you see, that you are not just another pawn harvested by the modern plantation, that you recognize the altar for what it is. Most men will stay silent. Most men will keep scrolling, keep consuming, keep obeying. But the few who declare, the few who step forward, those are the men who begin the path Ruth began. The Brotherhood thrives because most people never dare to speak the truth aloud. Ruth dared. That's why they erased her. And now you're being offered the same test. Silence or declaration, sleep or awakening, the harvest or the blade. Choose carefully. Because once you declare, the descent doesn't stop. It only deepens. The men Ruth struck down were not the end of the Brotherhood. They were only its outer ring, the visible masks, the pawns stationed on the plantation fields. Killing them did not destroy the order. It only forced it to shed its skin, to evolve into new forms. And that is how true power survives. It doesn't break, it adapts. Look closely at the decades after Ruth's disappearance. The South did not collapse. The plantations grew larger. The wealth of the Cotton Empire swelled. And when slavery was finally abolished, do you think the Brotherhood vanished into dust? No. They transformed. They traded whips for contracts, chains for debts, overseers for bankers. The altar never closed, it only modernized. You want proof? Look at the institutions you serve today. The courthouse, where rulings are handed down not for truth but for order. The church, where men are taught not to seek God within themselves, but to submit to the hierarchy. The schools, where obedience is graded higher than courage. Do you see it now? The Brotherhood didn't vanish. It grew. It became faceless, nameless, systemic. It no longer needed cloaked rituals in the fields because the entire society became the ritual. And here is the part that makes men tremble. The same symbols Ruth carved into flesh are still carved into the world around you. They're hidden in the dollar bill, etched into government seals, woven into architecture that towers above your head every day. The Brotherhood marked its territory, and now you walk inside their temple without even knowing it. Do you think it's an accident that you feel small in those marble halls of government? That the architecture of banks and churches dwarfs you like a child? That was the design. Every column, every dome, every seal, it's not decoration, it's doctrine. It tells you silently, you are beneath us. Ruth saw through it. That's why. They erased her. Not because she killed 13 men, but because she glimpsed the deeper structure and acted against it. That is why her story is more dangerous than any sermon or book. Because it proves the structure can be seen, and once seen, it can be opposed. But here is the bitter truth. Most men will never see it. They will die in the plantation, serving the altar, thinking themselves free. The question is, will you? The cotton fields were never just fields, they were laboratories, testing grounds where the Brotherhood perfected the art of control. What began with chains and overseers became something far more insidious, something invisible, psychological. Because the Brotherhood discovered a dark truth: physical bondage is crude, mental bondage is eternal. Think about it. A man in chains may fight. A man in debt will obey willingly. A man beaten may resist. A man programmed will resist himself. That is the evolution of control, and it was born in the fields where Ruth first struck. The overseer's whip became the school teacher's gradebook, the banker's ledger, the politician's speech. The system no longer needed violence in the open. It could manufacture obedience through symbols, rituals, and repetition. Look at the media that floods your eyes every day. It distracts you, pacifies you, numbs you into submission. Endless noise, endless arguments, endless fear. So you never notice the altar you're kneeling before. Look at the politics that split you left and right. You think you're choosing sides, but you're still inside the same plantation, playing a role written for you long before you cast your vote. Look at the pulpits that preach guilt and sin, not empowerment. They strip you of inner sovereignty and sell it back to you in fragments, and all of it flows from the same blueprint. The Brotherhood knew long ago that if you want to enslave men, you don't need to chain their bodies. You chain their attention, you chain their desires, you chain their minds to illusions so they will defend the very system that devours them. That is the new plantation, and millions of men live and die in it without ever seeing the altar. Do you see now why Ruth's story had to be buried? If the world knew that one woman had pierced the veil, that she had seen the ritual for what it was, then every man might begin to look closer at his own life. Every man might begin to question. And questioning is lethal to control. The Brotherhood thrives on blindness. They need you asleep. They need you obedient. They need you distracted by bread, by circus, by false promises of freedom. Because the moment you truly see, the ritual begins to crumble. And that moment is happening now, for you. You've been taught to believe rituals are ancient things, robes, candles, Latin chants. But the most powerful rituals are the ones you perform every day without even knowing. That is how the Brotherhood survived. Not by forcing you into temples, but by turning your entire life into one. Every morning when you wake and reach for your phone, you enter their ritual. The screen floods your mind with distraction, pulling your energy into the system before you've even spoken a word. Every time you sign a contract you don't understand. Every time you repeat a slogan you didn't write. Every time you salute a flag without questioning who stitched it. You are bowing at their altar. And the cruelest part is that you call it normal life. Think about the way you spend your days. You work hours that drain your body and soul. You give your labor to corporations you'll never meet. You accept the wages they offer, and you tell yourself it's fair because everyone else does the same. That is a ritual. That is obedience dressed as tradition. Do you really think that's freedom? Or is it the echo of the same plantation Ruth once saw? The overseer replaced with a manager, the whip replaced with debt, the slave cabin replaced with a mortgage you'll never truly own. Even your celebrations are rituals of control. You cheer for holidays they chose, buy gifts they told you to, and call it joy. You kneel in pews to repeat words written centuries ago and call it faith. You pledge allegiance to institutions that bleed you dry and call it patriotism. Do you see it now? Every ritual of your life was scripted for you long before you were born. This is why Ruth's story had to vanish. Because once you see the pattern, The spell begins to break. Once you realize your own complicity, that you've been bowing every day, you face the same choice Ruth faced. Will you keep feeding the altar, or will you invert it, desecrate it, and claim back the power you've been taught to surrender? The Brotherhood fears not violence, they fear awareness, because awareness is the one thing they cannot chain. That is why Ruth became a ghost in history. That is why you were never meant to hear this story, because if you awaken, you are no longer theirs. The Brotherhood never vanished. It simply learned how to wear respectable faces. In Ruth's time, their altar was the cotton field. Today, their altar is the institution. They've wrapped themselves in the banners of legitimacy, government, finance, religion, science, so that when you serve them, you don't call it slavery. You call it progress. Look carefully at the structures that rule your life. The government tells you it protects freedom, but binds you with laws so intricate that ignorance itself becomes a crime. The banks promise stability, but chain entire nations in debt they can never escape. The churches promise salvation, but strip men of their own inner fire, replacing direct power with dependency on the hierarchy. Even the sciences, those shrines of reason, serve as their priests, dismissing anything that doesn't feed the machine. These are not neutral institutions. They are masks. Masks of the same order Ruth once exposed with her blade. And what is the mark of their presence? Symbols. Always symbols. They hide in plain sight, etched into architecture, woven into corporate logos, engraved into the seals of power. You've seen them. The eye within the pyramid, the twin pillars, the broken circle. They stare at you from dollar bills, courthouse, walls, cathedral ceilings, and you walk beneath them as if blind. This is how power works, not by hiding, but by making itself so obvious that no one dares to question it. Do you understand how dangerous that is? The Brotherhood doesn't need secrecy anymore. Their doctrine is carved into the world itself. They've reached a level of dominance where you participate willingly, never even realizing that you are kneeling. That is the perfection of psychological control. To enslave a man so completely that he thanks you for the chains. But Ruth's shadow lingers. Her story is proof that even within the system a fracture can form. She looked at the altar and dared to desecrate it. She saw the symbols and dared to carve them back into the flesh of their priests. And though the Brotherhood erased her name, her act could not be unmade. That is why you are hearing this now, because the current she entered still flows beneath the surface, and now it has touched you. You followed Ruth into the fields, you've seen the symbols carved in blood, the erasure, the silence. And now the question presses against you like a blade at your throat. Why are you hearing this story at all? Why did it reach you? Why? Now, because you are standing in the same place Ruth once stood. The system that bound her is the system that binds you, and the same choice she faced waits before you, submission or awakening. The altar has not changed, only its form. Look at yourself honestly. How much of your life has been lived on their terms? The job you serve, the debts you carry, the rules you obey, the fears you repeat, are they yours? Or are they the Brotherhood's script written into you from birth? They don't need overseers anymore because you oversee yourself. You silence your own questions, you chain your own hands, and then you call it responsibility, maturity, normalcy. That is the ritual at work. That is the harvest. But once in a generation, someone sees through it. Someone hears the hum beneath the surface and realizes the world is not what it pretends to be. Ruth heard it. That is why she acted, not out of madness, but out of clarity. She knew the cost of obedience, and she chose desecration. She inverted the ritual. And though they erased her, they could not erase the fracture she created. That fracture is where you now stand. Do you feel it? The pull in your chest, the heat in your blood. That is not fear. It is recognition. The recognition that you are not powerless, that the same fire that burned in Ruth's veins burns in yours. But fire without direction is chaos. To wield it, you must choose. You must step across the line between spectator and participant, between pawn and player, between harvest and blade. This is where the descent becomes transformation. This is where the truth is no longer information, it is initiation. And initiation demands one thing above all else: courage. So I ask you, as Ruth was once asked in silence by the altar itself, will you remain as you are, a servant of their symbols? Or will you cross into the forbidden, where men are remade, and nothing is ever the same again? Do not mistake this for a fairy tale. Awakening is not glory, it is burden. Ruth did not find peace when she saw through the veil. She found blood, she found isolation, she found the crushing weight of truth that no one else dared to carry. That is the price of seeing, and it is the same price you will pay if you step beyond the illusions that cradle the masses. Most men are comfortable in their chains. They prefer distraction over truth, obedience over power. They are content to laugh, drink, work, and die inside the ritual, never once lifting their eyes to see the altar above them, and the system rewards them for it. It feeds them entertainment, shallow pleasures, and the illusion of safety. It tells them, obey, and you will be comfortable. Obey, and you will belong. Obey, and you will be remembered as good. But what is the cost of that comfort? It is the death of your fire, the death of your sovereignty, the quiet suffocation of your soul until you are nothing but another obedient servant buried nameless in their fields. That is the bargain the Yoi Brotherhood offers. That is the bargain most men take. Ruth refused, and that refusal transformed her into something more than a woman. It made her a symbol, a fracture, a mirror. And though she was erased, her shadow still walks among us, whispering the same question into the ear of every man who dares to look. Will you carry the burden? Understand this: once you awaken, there is no turning back. You cannot unsee the symbols carved into your life. You cannot unhear the hidden rhythm beneath their sermons and speeches. You cannot unknow that you were born into a plantation disguised as freedom. And that is why awakening is feared. Not because it destroys the brotherhood instantly, but because it removes you from their grip forever. Most men will never take this step. They will keep their chains polished and call them blessings. But you are hearing this because you were not meant to be most men. You were meant to feel the fracture open inside you, to feel the altar's shadow and to choose. That choice will cost you, but to refuse it will cost you even more. Ruth's story does not end in the fields. It does not end in the blood or in the whispers of her disappearance. Her story ends here, with you. Because what vanished that night in 1839 was not just a woman, but a fragment of truth, carried forward like a smoldering ember waiting for someone willing to take the fire. That ember has passed through shadows, through silence, through generations of men who dared to look where others would not. And now it burns in your hands. Understand this: the Brotherhood does not fear death. It does not fear exposure. What it fears is the awakening of even one man who sees through its disguises and refuses to kneel. Ruth became that fracture, and in hearing her story, you are invited to become the next. That is the truth they tried to bury in cotton and blood. That the altar only has power as long as you believe it does. Every chain they forged, every ritual they performed, every symbol they carved into your world collapses the moment you step outside their script. That is the secret hidden beneath centuries of control. They cannot hold you once you awaken. And they know it. That is why they erase. That is why they suppress. That is why Ruth's name was scrubbed from the record. Erasure is never total, the shadow remains, and in that shadow men are reborn. Now you stand before the same altar. The fields are different, the masks are different, but the choice is the same: obedience or transformation. Will you remain as one of the harvest, or will you become the blade that cuts the cycle? If you have followed me this far, then write these words in the comments, not once but twice, to seal what has already begun inside you. I break the altar. I am the fire. Do this, and you do more than speak. You declare war on the script written into your life. You declare that you are no longer theirs. You join Ruth and every forgotten soul who ever chose truth over chains. And remember, once you step across this threshold, there is no turning back. The world will never look the same. The altar will never hold you again. You are no longer a servant. You are no longer blind. You are the fracture. You are the fire. The brotherhood fears you now, and that is how you know you are free.